I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to part two of our look at a new investigation by The Nation headlined How Big Wireless Made Us Think That Cell Phones Are Safe. It reveals how cell phones were first marketed to U.S. consumers in the 1980s without any government safety testing. Then, a decade later, one of the industry's own hand-picked researchers, George Carlo, reportedly told top company officials, including leaders of Apple, AT&T and Motorola, that some industry commission studies raised serious questions about cell phone safety. On October 7, 1999, Carlos sent letters to industry CEOs urging them to give consumers, quote, the information they need to make an informed judgment about how much of this unknown risk they wish to assume. Instead, the Cellular Telecommunications and Internet Association reportedly tried to discredit Carlos' findings and had him physically removed from its premises during its annual conference in February 2000.
The Nation investigation notes Carlos' story evokes eerie parallels with two of the most notorious cases of corporate deception on record, the campaigns by the tobacco and fossil fuel industries to obscure the dangers of smoking and climate change, respectively. For more, we continue with our interview with one of the authors of the new investigation, Mark Hertsgaard, the Nation's environment correspondent and investigative editor. So, Mark Hertsgaard, if you could reiterate, at this point in 2018, as you evaluate the science or talk to the scientists who are evaluating it, what do you think is of most concern about cell phones? And then talk about ways to mitigate the effects of cell phones.
Sure. I want to emphasize I'm not a scientist. I'm a journalist and an author, but we talk to a lot of scientists. And our story does not say whether cell phones are safe or not. We looked at the industry disinformation and propaganda campaign that for the past 25 years has been convincing the public that these cell phones are safe. And the way they've done that is to war game the science, as they put it in an internal memo from Motorola. They've funded their friendly scientists. They've attacked critical science, independent science. They've put their own people onto advisory boards. All that said, that's resulted in, I think, the message coming across from the mainstream media, frankly, that cell phones are safe enough, shall we say. However, that point of view took a major hit just last week, the night before we released our story. There was a peer review by independent scientists of the biggest study that the United States government has had to date on cell phone radiation. This was a study by the U.S. National Toxicology Program. That's part of the National Institutes of Health. The study was commissioned by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and released some preliminary findings in February, and then those findings were peer-reviewed by independent scientists last week. And those independent scientists finally concluded that there was, quote, clear evidence, unquote, clear evidence that cell phone radiation can cause cancers. And notably, those independent scientists upgraded the confidence level of that and other findings by this National Toxicology Program. So what that seemed to do was to confirm the suspicions by outsiders that the National Toxicology Program brass, the people up at the top, were trying to downplay this study because it was the very same data that had been released in 2016, and when that data was released in 2016, it came with a public health warning by the National Toxicology Program. Then in 2018, and back in February, they tried to downplay this. So it's very significant that last week these independent scientists said, oh no, there is clear evidence here that cell phones can cause cancer. Now, before you all worry out there that you're having the equivalent of a cigarette habit, let me just say that the evidence is not yet definitive of how high the risk is for cancer, and genetic damage is another concern here. But it is definitely, it seems, a risk. If you look at the scientific data that is compiled by the National Institutes of Health, the actual studies that they catalog there, the vast majority of them do indicate that there are health impacts of this technology, of this radiation, I should say, according to Henry Lai, a professor at the University of Washington, who's analyzed all of this, and we talked with him in some detail. So there are things you can do. The main thing you can do as a consumer is to minimize your use of your cell phone. Use a landline telephone whenever you can. And if you must use a cell phone, always use earbuds and use it for as little time as possible. Don't go on and on. Have your phone call and complete it. And in general, you want to try and minimize the risk. Again, I am not a pediatrician. I'm not a doctor here. You can talk to organizations like the American Pediatrics Association, which, by the way, told the Federal Communications Commission 5 years ago that they needed to revisit this question because their standards weren't adequate. The FCC has not done that, but you can talk to them. You can talk to a group called the Environment Health Trust, and they will give you more information on this. That's
really interesting that you talk about the FCC, and they haven't done that, because the former head of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was Tom Wheeler. In 1999, then the president of the Cellular Telecommunications and Internet Association, Thomas Wheeler, spoke to ABC News 2020. Listen carefully.
I mean, I believe that the cellular phone is safe. Our industry has gone out and aggressively asked the question, can we find a problem? And the answer that has come back is that there is nothing that has come up in the research that suggests that there is a linkage between the use of a wireless phone and health effects.
So that was, yes, Thomas Wheeler, who was President Obama's pick as FCC chair, speaking to Brian Ross on ABC. Mark Hertzgaard, can you talk about his role?
And that was a lie. That was a lie that Mr. Wheeler told. We spoke with Mr. Wheeler for this story. He gave us an interview, but insisted on putting it off the record, except for one statement that said that he followed the recommendations of the Food and Drug Administration, which had found no dangers from health phones. But what he told Brian Ross in that story, that they went out and aggressively questioned the science, was their problem, that part was true. But to say that they found no such evidence, that was an absolute lie. And I use the word lie deliberately. He knew perfectly well by that time that he had been told by George Carlo, the scientist, that there were serious questions from their own $28.5 million research program. And so to me, the career of Tom Wheeler is an interesting illustration of a very old story in Washington, D.C. about how the regulatory agencies of the federal government get captured by the very industries that they are supposed to regulate. So Wheeler left the industry and later went on to head the FCC for President Obama. And in the meantime, it's gone the other way around. The FCC vice president at the FCC, I guess, or vice chair rather, Baker, came to now runs the Trade Association. And this is why the Harvard study on this by Norm Alster calls the FCC a captured agency. They have been captured by the industry they're supposed to regulate. And the single best example of that I can give you is the FCC does not even independently test the radiation levels on these phones. They take what the industry claims and just put it on their website. That is not good enough. Part of the reason that we're down this road the way we are so far is that we did not test cell phones back in the 1980s before they went on the consumer market. And we're about to make that same mistake again with 5G technology.
Well, can you explain what 5G technology is?
Sure. 5G means fifth generation, and that's the next generation of the technologies that have been used for cell phones and wireless going back into the 1990s. And where people might have heard of it most is 5G technology is what will be required if we go to this thing called the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is the idea of your smartphone being connected to your smart car and your smart household so that all of your appliances, your cell phones, your computers, everything will be connected 24/7 so that you can, while you're driving home, you can turn on the oven 25 minutes from home so that it's nice and warm and you can make your dinner when you get home. That seems like it's a kind of a convenient idea, perhaps. But when we did the reporting on this, my colleague Mark Dowie went to the conference of the industry and saw, and we have this picture in the Nation magazine story, saw a picture of a baby, a doll, wearing a diaper, and at the crotch of the diaper is a little transmitter. So this transmitter, under the 5G technology, Internet of Things, this transmitter will send a little message to mom or dad in the next room that, oh, the baby's diaper needs changing. Well, do we really need that? And do we really want to have radiation going from our baby's crotch to our cell phones? Why don't we just walk into the next room and check for ourselves?
In January 1993, David Reynard of Tampa, Florida, sued the NEC America company. Speaking on national TV, Reynard said his wife's NEC phone caused her lethal brain tumor. Let's go to a clip from ABC News' 2020 investigation that aired in 1999 that begins with Reynard.
Tumor was exactly in the pattern of the antenna.
David Reynard went on to almost single-handedly create a national scare when he filed a lawsuit and went public with his allegations.
Well, we're suing the carrier, we're suing the manufacturer.
There was great alarm on Wall Street, and even though Reynard's lawsuit was later thrown out by a judge for a lack of reliable scientific evidence, it left the cell phone industry with a huge public relations problem.
So, Mark, could you comment on that, and also the distinction, if there is any, in terms of possible risks of using a cell phone to talk as against using it for email or for texting? Is there a difference from what you've learned about possible risks?
That's really where the industry, wireless industry's propaganda campaign was launched. Because as Brian Ross's report just showed, they had a huge public relations problem at that point. There were congressional subcommittees beginning to investigate. The stock on Wall Street was tanking. And that's when Tom Wheeler stepped up and immediately told a hastily gathered press conference, cell phones are safe, but we're going to revalidate that with this new science. And that was how they then found George Carlo, the scientist who they hired to do that. And it's interesting, George Carlo, I wouldn't call him a whistleblower exactly, but he certainly did not work out the way that the industry had hoped. They had hired him because he seemed like, by his own acknowledgement in our interviews with him, he seemed like an industry guy. And they thought that because he had previously done studies in which he said dioxin was not terribly harmful in small quantities. Dioxin, of course, was behind the Love Canal and the Agent Orange scandals, one of the most toxic chemicals on Earth. He had also said that breast implants were not necessarily dangerous. So George Carlos seemed like the kind of guy who would return a friendly verdict for the industry, and then he did not. And that is really where their ways parted. And Carlo eventually told the truth, both to Brian Ross and to us, and in a book, Cell Phone Radiation, if listeners want to check that out. Now, to your question, Amin, about the differences, again, I'm not a scientist here. I'm a little uncomfortable talking about that. There are plenty of places where you can go to get good information on this. I'd recommend the National Environment Trust is one. The American Pediatrics Association has also raised concerns about this. However, I do know this from sources that we've interviewed on this story, that you want to always wear earbuds if you're going to use a phone. You want to minimize your use of the phone. And yes, texting is better than a phone call in terms of the amount of radiation you're exposed to. And also, the moment of the connection of the call is when there is the biggest surge of radiation. That is, after you've dialed and you hear it ringing and then it connects to the other phone, at that moment, hold that phone away from you. The farther away it is from your skull, the less radiation that is going to be touching you. But again, the main thing is to just limit your use of all of this to the maximum extent that you can. Use landlines when you can. You know, the world still spun on its axis. We all had our lives before there were cell phones. You can do it, folks.
I wanted to ask you about the criticism of your piece. Dr. David Gorski, a surgical oncologist at Barbara Ann Carmano's Sun Cancer Institute, wrote a piece for his blog Science-Based Medicine criticizing your report. His post is headlined, "The Nation Indulges in Fear-Mongering About Cell Phones and Cancer." In it, Dr. Gorski writes, an article published last week in The Nation likens wireless telephone companies to tobacco and fossil fuel episodes in their tactics of spreading fear, misinformation, and doubt regarding the science of cell phone radiation and health. To produce this narrative, the investigation's authors rely on unreliable sources and cherry-pick scientific studies, ignoring the scientific consensus that cell phone radiation almost certainly doesn't cause cancer, all the while disingenuously claiming that they aren't taking a position on the health effects of radio waves. And Dr. Gorski continues, the idea that the radio frequency electromagnetic radiation used by cell phones and wireless networks is somehow causing horrendous health effects in humans, be it cancer, brain, breast, or other, behavioral problems, mental illness, or whatever, is like anti-vaccine pseudoscience, a claim not supported by evidence that just will not go away, says Dr. Gorski. Your response to that, Mark Hertsgaard?
Thank you, Dr. Gorski, for providing such a illuminating illustration of the very kind of disinformation campaign we're talking about here. We're not scientists, but maybe he would revisit his blog post if he looked at what the peer review of independent credentialed scientists just said last week about the National Toxicology Program's finding. They said, quote unquote, clear evidence that cell phone radiation causes cancer. We are not cherry picking. That is exactly what the biggest study ever funded by the United States government has said about this. And it was not what the government agency was trying to say. The government agency was trying to retreat from that position, and it's only because of peer-reviewed scientists on the outside that we know that. Go back and read our piece and compare it to the good doctor's blog. I'm very confident that our reporting stands up.
Well, Mark, I know you have to take your daughter, Kiara, to school. Congratulations on her 13th birthday today. Does Kiara have a cell phone?
She has a cell phone that I will say her mother gave her over my objection.
Oh, boy, we're not going there.
And we're not going to go there, but she is limited on the cell phone and knows that you must always use earplugs and earbuds, rather, and to limit the usage. So we try and analyze it like that. And she has promised to watch this show and to read the Nation piece, and we're going to revisit all that. I understand this is something that is in every household in America. And by the way, we didn't talk about this, but they also deliberately addicted their customers to this technology. Just like the cigarette companies, the tobacco companies added nicotine to cigarettes, the wireless companies deliberately addicted people to this technology. They've admitted that. Sean Parker at Facebook talked about that in November. And they are now regretting that, some of those individuals. But the fact remains that this is a highly addictive technology. And they were told 20 years ago that this could cause cancer in kids. And they kept doing it. Think about that. Think about that.
Well, let's end with Sean Parker, who was speaking at an Axios event in Philadelphia last year. Facebook's founding president, Sean Parker, who said Facebook was deliberately designed to hook users.
That thought process was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you, more likes and comments. I mean, it's a social validation feedback loop that it's like it's exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. It literally changes your relationship with society, with each other, with it probably interferes with productivity in weird ways. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains.
That's Facebook's founding president, Sean Parker, talking about how the site was deliberately designed to hook users. That does it for our interview with Mark Hertsgaard, the Nation's environment correspondent and investigative editor. We will link to the Nation's new investigation, which he co-wrote with Mark Dowey, headlined, How Big Wireless Made Us Think That Cell Phones Are Safe. Mark Hertsgaard is the author of 7 books, including Hot, Living Through the Next 50 Years on Earth. To see part 1 of our discussion with Mark Hertsgaard, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.
I moved to California, Southern California. The 60 hertz work that we did was supported by a contract from the Department of Energy. The radio frequency radiation work that we did was supported by Motorola. The relationship was really very cordial and very stress-free, but only up until we started generating data. These folks were very, very upset and began to talk about how are they going to handle this, what sort of spin can we put on this, what can we expect from this, and from that point on the relationship changed. What we saw was that Motorola began to exert more and more control over the work, telling us what to do, telling us how to write abstracts, what to say in the abstracts, what to say in the papers. I said, how to do the work. No, don't do this. Yes, do it this way. This was unacceptable. I had completed our study of DNA damage, and I submitted the final report to Motorola, and I got a call from Mays Swycord at Motorola. Now, Mays is the former head of the Center for, CDRH, Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA, and he left the FDA and went to work for Motorola. Keep that connection in mind. That's interesting. He also handpicked his successor at the FDA. Anyhow, Mays didn't like the work. Then there was another phone call. Point is, I kept getting nothing from these people. They simply weren't willing to accept my interpretation of my study, my evaluation of my study, my knowledge of science at that point, and tried to urge me not to publish the study. They didn't tell me not to. They just said, no, this isn't ready for publication. And they wanted me to do more work. I stopped taking calls from them, and I went ahead and published the study. It came out in 1998, and I wanted nothing more to do with any Motorola-related work. I wasn't going to put up with that kind of control. I wouldn't put up with that attitude. That was it. I think one has to exercise caution at this point, and what makes...
I'm here in Brussels to attend conference on electrical hypersensitivity and multiple chemical sensitivity. And the reason that we're holding this conference is because there are so many people suffering from environmental illness, and it's important to get the scientific community together with the medical community so that we can help people recover from electrical hypersensitivity.
My background is as a neuroscientist. I've studied the central and peripheral nervous system. We had struggled for many years to get some form of answer to the simple question, a person with electrohypersensitivity, what is he or she?
This Congress is trying to raise awareness among healthcare practitioners because so few of them recognize environmental sensitivities, and very often people are misdiagnosed as having psychological problems rather than physiological responses to environmental stressors.
If I ask you how much more such radiation does penetrate your body today compared to like 10 years ago, is it twice as much? 3 times as much? No, it's a quintillion times more. That's a 1 with 18 zeros.
Dean Mariels, I'm honored to be here. It's a privilege to see so many of you. I must say I'm thrilled to be at this great university, which has a tradition of open and democratic discussion, and I look forward to having a frank and full conversation, as we say in the diplomatic world. Because the issue I'm going to talk with you about is, there isn't one truth, of course. Truth is a relative term. At one point, the truth was the world was flat. When we talk about truth in science, of course, it's always relative. But there are now more than 6 billion cell phones in the world today, 8 billion wireless transmitting devices, more than 50 billion are anticipated to form the Internet of Things, and we have to recognize that we don't know a lot about the public health and environmental effects of this form of radiation. You've mentioned some of my career. I won't go through this in any great detail, but I would say to you that probably the most important thing I did, and I see many people in this room aren't even old enough to remember it, but a long time ago, you used to have smoke on airplanes. People could smoke tobacco on airplanes. And I was involved as a young scientist in the committee that actually reviewed the data and recommended that there be no smoking on airplanes. You may be shocked to hear that it was even a question for science at the time, but it was. And when I look at what we know now about mobile phone radiation, I see some very interesting similarities, because there were a lot of questions that were raised about the safety of tobacco on airplanes. And they were, in fact, legitimate questions, things we did not know. There are a lot of important questions to be asked about mobile phone radiation today, without any doubt. But the reality is we're not asking those questions. And with the exception of some researchers here and elsewhere, very little new research is being done in this field. So it's a thrill to be here, because Australia has been a leader in research in the field of electrical engineering and its applications to medicine, doing some of the most exciting work in the world and funded by institutions around the world, including the US Department of Defense. And I've worked at some of the top institutions in the world in science, and so when I first thought there could be something wrong with mobile phones, I actually owned 3 phones at the time. I own 2 now. And everybody has to downsize a bit. And I didn't believe there was a problem, and I thought if there were a problem, I would know about it, because of course I knew all about what was important in science. Well, I was wrong. I liked the fact that I could call people or actually send them messages and expect an answer at all hours of the day, and found it kind of fun in the beginning. And when somebody said to me there could be a problem with this with our health, I said, oh, don't be ridiculous. If there was a problem, I'd know about it. Well, I was wrong. And what I now know is that information is being sent to people routinely to give them safety information. I'm going to ask you to help me out here by looking at how many of you have an iPhone. Now, I assume you didn't all turn them off. So, for those of you who have an iPhone, would you nod, raise your hand again? I'd like you to share with your colleagues. So please go to the settings on your phone, all right? Please take a moment and nod when you've got there. All right? And be prepared to share, all right? Go to settings on the phone. Got there? All right. Now, get to settings. Now go to about. I'm sorry, you have to go to general first. There's a mistake here. You have to go to general. All right? Under general, under settings. Then go to about, which is at the top. You got there? About, yes? Okay. Now you have to scroll all the way down to something you don't normally see, called legal. You got to legal? All right. Now click on RF exposure. Now you can read it later, but it's basically telling you that you need to know that you cannot keep the phone directly next to your body without exceeding the as-tested exposure guidelines. And by the way, the iPhone does it. I happen to know how to find it on the iPhone. I'm just learning the Android system myself. But all smartphones come with some information that basically says, don't keep the phone in your pocket or you will exceed the as-tested exposure guidelines. Now, how many of you knew that before today? Well, this is a very well-informed audience relative to others. I want to thank Telstra because they actually are now giving people this information. And by the way, they're one of the first telecom companies in the world to do this. So I actually think it's a good thing. They're sending this message. How many of you have seen it? How many of you have actually looked at what it said? Well, here's what it says. This is what it says. And like most of you, I found messages like this annoying, but the reality is Telstra is telling you to use a hands-free device to keep a mobile phone away from the head and body to reduce mobile phone exposure. So that's a good thing. But on the other hand, I think that we all need to do better to give people information so that you have knowledge about how to reduce exposure. And I'm going to explain to you why we need to reduce exposure. Let's go back to almost 20 years ago when standards for cell phones were first set up. At that time, it was believed that the only thing you had to worry about was avoiding heat. That was the only effect you had to be concerned about. And so they employed the head of a very large person, a 220-pound male, who was at the top 98th percentile of military recruits in 1989 in the United States. And they set the standards to avoid heating up that fellow's brain after a 6-minute phone call. Now, there's probably 1 or 2 people in this room with a head that size. But the rest of you, like most of the world, have much smaller heads and relatively smaller bodies. And this standard, which is very much out of date, doesn't take into account the fact that people the size of these 2 bright young people here in the front row are using these devices today with no thought that maybe they're getting exposed to levels of radiation that have not been evaluated for their safety in young developing brains. Now, the electromagnetic spectrum, this is information from ARPANSA, actually goes all the way from the invisible to the visible, ionizing radiation, gamma rays, X-rays over here, and light here. This is from ARPANSA. You will see here they say FM radio, microwave oven, radiant heat. Of course, microwave oven actually happens to be of the same frequency as the cell phone, the mobile phone. The mobile phone and the microwave oven use a very similar frequency. The difference between them is power. The power of the microwave oven is 1,000 watts. And of course, that's power that can heat up a cup of water in maybe 60 seconds. The microwave oven, the mobile phone, the cordless phone, the Wi-Fi monitor, the baby monitor, they all use the same frequency. They differ in power. They also differ because mobile phones and Wi-Fi devices emit pulsed microwave radiation. It's the pulse, not the power, that appears to be biologically most important. The pulse that is erratic and irregular, like for thousands of minutes a month, for dozens of hours a week, over a lifetime, that irregular pulsed signal may be much more biologically important. And in fact, the continuous wave signals have a lot of therapeutic effects as are being applied in medicine today. This visualization from my colleague at the University of Athens shows you the variation in frequency, in amplitude, in pulse. All of these variables influence the properties a signal have and how it can affect a biological system. This is just to show you what happens in a 4-second mobile phone call. This is power density indicated here. And of course, a phone is on standby, it's not doing too much, but 900 times a minute, it's looking for a signal. It says to the tower, where are you? Here I am. Where are you? Here I am. It's smart. That's how it's supposed to do. Now, when the phone rings, the worst time for you to put a phone right next to your head is when you answer it and say hello, because it's smart and it goes to max power. They're programmed to do that. Max power. Now, it's going to go to max power. You're going to listen, and then it will go up and down and up and down. And again, it's that variation. It's the delta. It's the cumulative integrative dose under the curve over a lifetime of exposure that looks to be biologically important. Now, exposure is a kind of funny thing. There's a rather widely distributed paper by Ken Foster and C.K. Cho that said that the exposure of an adult and the exposure of a child is identical. And therefore, there's no real difference in how the radiation might be affecting them. Well, let me explain something by showing off my daughter and my granddaughter. My granddaughter is a very light-skinned, red-haired, blue-eyed child. Her skin is very sensitive. My daughter is darker-haired like I am. If they have sunscreen on, they still will get a different dose of ultraviolet light, even though they have the same exposure. Because the exposure may be uniform, but the amount they will absorb differs because the properties of the skin, the property of the eye, the thinness of the skin, and a number of other variables. And those same things are relevant when it comes to thinking about cell phone radiation. Now, way back in the dark ages, when the standards were developed, two-dimensional modeling showed that children and smaller adults might absorb more radiation than larger adults. And this was scalar modeling that has now been superseded, done by Om Gandhi in 1996. Interestingly, and this is why I'm really delighted to be here, Dean, when he did this work in 1996, he was working with support from Motorola and the Department of Defense. And after he published this, he lost all his funding. That's why I'm really happy when you told me that Australia is not America. Because I think you have an opportunity to do something here in this great country. You have a tradition of independence in science and in this country that we do not have, unfortunately, on this issue in the United States. So Professor Gandhi, with whom I'm collaborating now, updated his work in 2002, here showing you that a smaller adult head here, you see the amount of exposure is quite similar, but because the head is smaller, it will absorb proportionally more. More recently, we have been working with colleagues at Porto Alegre with Environmental Health Trust, and we have developed three-dimensional modeling with anatomically based models using MRI to create the models with 1 millimeter voxels. And what we have done is to show the difference in radiation dose in heads of different ages and sizes. And I'll just show you one example here, coming from our colleagues at the Swiss National Institute of Technology, the ITIS, which have produced some of the most brilliant work in the world in this field. And they have shown here, of course, that there is going to be greater exposure absorption into a younger head versus an older head. This is another item from their website of target tissue dose for the infant with using a system called the virtual family. Is there anyone here who's worked on the virtual family? Right. It's a really powerful and very sophisticated system that is used today to set standards for medical devices and surgical procedures, but it's not used for mobile phone standards. I find that odd. And I want to show you an example of some of the work that we are doing now that I'm releasing here for the first time. And this is a modeled microwave radiation dose of a 6-year-old with greater levels to the frontal and temporal lobes, eyes and cheek. And watch this here. Now, yellow, white, and red are the hottest, all right? And if you look carefully, you will see it's going into the eye, the nose. Do it again, just so you'll get to see it. And partly into the brainstem. Now, that's just showing you that there's going to be some exposure into that area of a young head. It doesn't tell you that there's any biological effect, right? Now, the next slide is going to show you something that might be of interest to students and faculty here. And that has to do with exposure to the reproductive organs. We call them the gonads. I think you say the testicles, and bone marrow. And look here at the radiation as it gets into the groin area. And that's just from having a mobile phone modeled into the pocket. And this, again, is based on normalized SAR with I think we had a dipole antenna. And there are many different variables you can alter in coming up with this kind of simulation, right? The number of antenna, whether it's GSM, CDMA, whether it's simultaneously operating only one antenna or more than one. But we believe that this is the kind of work that needs to be done and that this institution might be in a position to do it. And my colleagues from Brazil would be happy to share with you the modeling that we have done to date to generate this. But based on this work and other studies that have been done around the world, the United States magazine Consumer Reports recently recommended that nobody keep a phone in their pocket. Nobody. And in fact, if phones were tested in pockets, they would exceed the as-tested exposure guidelines, which is why Telstra has recently issued that advice. Now, when it comes to pregnancy, we're working with Yale University and more than 100 physicians and experts in the United States and around the world who are specialists in pregnancy. And we have been modeling exposure to the head at the end of pregnancy. And at the end of pregnancy, when of course the head, as any woman here knows, is right at the surface, if you're lucky it's at the surface and it's not facing the spine, then you can get the greatest exposure because of course the skin is completely permeable to this radiation exposure. And that's why we've developed the Baby Safe project with colleagues at Yale to advise pregnant women to protect their abdomens from mobile phone radiation, as well as from iPads, which I should add, iPads and other devices are called tablets because they belong on tables. They are tested 20 centimeters away from that big guy that I showed you before. 20 centimeters away. They are not approved to be held in the laps of little children, although millions of kids are having them now in schools because the people involved in educational technology and those involved in public health research are not talking to one another. Because if they were, they would understand that you're giving children a two-way microwave radiating device, and if you must give them such a device for learning purposes, put it on airplane mode so that it's not sending and receiving signals as it does otherwise. Now, this is some new modeling, again, that we've developed with colleagues in Brazil, and we can share with you how we've done it. We first start out with the MRI and create the model with 1 millimeter voxels, and this is quite a bit of work goes into creating this, and here is what it looks like after a period of 6 minutes. And that's really not as bad as it might look because you see the red area only gets partway through the eye of the adult, right? The one that we're really concerned about is this one with the young child. And this is a 3-year-old brain that we modeled. And you see that by the end of that 6-minute call, the peak radiation, yellow and red, is getting all the way into almost both eyes. And again, this is one call, and it's not going to kill anybody. It may not cause any biological effect whatsoever for 1 call or 2 calls or 3 calls. But the question is, what's the cumulative impact of this kind of exposure? How do we evaluate it? How do we study it? The problem we face is that right now, we're in the midst of an experiment on my grandchildren and your children, and we don't have anybody to compare them with. We don't have a control group in science. When you are given a drug, it's usually been studied where some people get the drug and some people don't get the drug, and they're called the controls. And then you see whether or not those who got the drug are healthier than those who did not.
Thank you, Chairman Bukes and members of the committee. Good evening. I'm here to explain in 7 minutes how radiation from cell phones and cell phone towers, like all forms of electromagnetic radiation, penetrate into the body, may damage cells, and potentially cause disease. But first, let me preface my talk by stating that I'm a practicing board-certified diagnostic radiologist who, like all radiologists, trained in radiation physics. I spend my days interpreting the images created by exposing the human body to different forms of radiation. In healthcare, radiation can be used to treat and diagnose disease like cancer, that can also cause disease and is therefore tightly regulated. Following are some pictures and videos I'd like to present to make a point. This is a chest x-ray. We are able to obtain this image because x-rays produced by an x-ray machine penetrate through the patient's chest and expose a plate on the opposite side of the body. X-rays are a form of electromagnetic radiation. In this image, you can see the finger glowing red when it is placed on a bright light. This is because light, like X-rays, can penetrate through the body's tissues. Light is a form of electromagnetic radiation. By placing a body in a strong magnetic field and subjecting it to pulses of radiofrequency radiation, we are able to get images like this one from an MRI of the shoulder. This technology is possible because both magnetic fields and radiofrequency radiation, just like light and X-rays, penetrate through the body and affect atoms and molecules. Now, this graphic depicts the continuum of frequencies that comprise the electromagnetic spectrum, and I placed the three images in the respective frequency bands. Microwaves and millimeter waves produced by the 5G network are demarcated by this sun. These frequencies also penetrate into the body. As you know, there are three bandwidths of frequency in the 5G network. The highest frequency band includes frequencies between 20 and 40 gigahertz. A meter recently became available to the public for the high frequency band detection. I'm going to show you a couple of brief videos demonstrating the use of this detector. I took these videos with my cell phone in airplane mode, and there were no other sources of 5G radiation and no Wi-Fi in the house. Now, if you look at this first video, which was taken in an interior room, you'll see the green indicator light is on, and the display reads less than 5 microwatts per meter squared. This is background. In this next video, you can see outside the front door of this home, there is a pole-mounted 5G small cell across the street. If I take out the detector and I turn on the volume, you can see that the radiation emitted from this small cell is erratic but continuous. The maximum tower density coming from the antenna on this front stoop is over 10,000 microwatts per meter squared. In this final video, you see radiation exposure one would receive in a third-floor bedroom with the window closed while lying on the bed. You can still hear the detectors picking up radiation, and while lying in bed, the person is still receiving a dose or power density of over 700 microwatts per meter squared. All forms of electromagnetic radiation penetrate the body. Some frequencies penetrate deeper than others. Unfortunately for all of us, and I do mean all of us, government regulations are still based on research performed by Hermann Schwann, a distinguished scientist who in 1953 said that heating effects should be used to determine safety limits for microwave radiation. I remember my father telling me when he was in college in 1953, he had heard over the cafeteria loudspeaker that Watson and Crick had discovered DNA. Yes, we've learned a lot since 1953. One of those things is that non-thermal effects occur in the body from non-ionizing radiation. Scientific studies have repeatedly shown that exposure to radiofrequency radiation can cause individual cells in the body to become stressed. The longer a cell is stressed, the greater the likelihood it may malfunction. You might think that the term stress implies a manageable state and that it's not a big deal, but let me clarify. Stress weakens the body's tissues. Just as stress can cause a bridge to collapse, stress can cause a bone to fracture, an ulcer to develop, or an organ system to fail. When cells undergo stress, unfortunate things can happen. Membranes which protect the cell and control the cell's internal environment can become damaged, causing the cell to lose its ability to function and put the cell's life at risk. The cell's mitochondria can become damaged and produce less energy and run less efficiently. If one continues to eat the same amount, but his or her cells can't use that food efficiently, they will gain weight and become obese. Proteins in a stressed cell can become damaged and denatured. This may sound esoteric, but consider that many diseases now common in our population, like Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, and amyloidosis, are all associated with protein denaturation. And importantly, when the cell is stressed, its DNA can become damaged, which can lead to mutations and possibly cancer. The impact of malfunctioning cells on one's clinical health status is determined by which cells and organs are damaged. If the thyroid gland is damaged, one will have clinical manifestations from abnormal thyroid function, including increased risk for cardiac arrhythmia. If radiation exposure affects white blood cells, it can cause immune dysfunction, making one more susceptible to disease. If the brain is affected, one may experience confusion, memory loss, ringing in the ears, vertigo, insomnia, and other symptoms. If a man's testicles are exposed, testosterone levels can drop, and sperm can become damaged, lose motility, and experience DNA fragmentation. Yes, there are many, many more examples of health effects associated with exposure to radiofrequency radiation described in the literature, and these conditions are becoming more and more prevalent as technology becomes more pervasive. One final point. I've heard it mentioned that the high-frequency band of 5G doesn't or shouldn't penetrate more than a few millimeters into the skin. Whether or not this is true, the thyroid gland is often only a few millimeters deep to the skin surface, and so are the testicles. Interfering with the function of these glands can cause systemic endocrine dysfunction, and in addition, many important cells, including red blood cells and immune cells, are just below the skin surface. Radiation doesn't need to go deep to cause damage. Thank you.